A moment of pain, a journey of understanding. Have you ever faced a moment in life so painful that it made you question everything? A loss so deep, a setback so unfair, or a betrayal so unexpected that you found yourself asking, why is this happening? To me, maybe you lost someone you love. Maybe your life took a turn you never saw coming. Maybe you wake up every day carrying a weight in your chest, wondering if things will ever make sense again. If you've ever felt this way, you are not alone. David knows that feeling all too well. At 70 years old, David had spent nearly half a century with the love of his life, Mary. She wasn't just his wife, she was his best friend, his partner in everything. Together, they built a life filled with love, laughter, and quiet moments of joy. He never imagined a day without her. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One autumn afternoon, Mary passed away suddenly after a brief illness. One day, she was there, smiling at him across the kitchen table. The next, she was gone. Just like that, the house they had built together now felt like a hollow space. The sound of her laughter, once filling every corner, had been replaced by an unbearable silence. David found himself lost in an ocean of grief, drowning in questions without answers. Why did this happen? Why her? Why now? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the pain didn't fade. It lingered in every empty chair, every untouched coffee mug, every quiet evening spent alone. People told him that time would heal, but time only seemed to make the loneliness sharper. He stopped answering phone calls. He stopped going to the park where he and Mary used to walk. He even stopped looking at himself in the mirror, because the man staring back wasn't the David he used to know. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. That on a particularly cold afternoon, David found himself sitting alone on a weathered park bench, the same one where he and Mary had once sat, feeding the birds and talking about nothing and everything. As he stared blankly ahead, an elderly man, dressed in simple robes, took a seat beside him. There was something peaceful about the man, something in his eyes that seemed to carry the weight of many lifetimes. The man glanced at David and smiled gently. "You look like someone carrying a heavy heart," he said. David hesitated. He wasn't in the mood for conversation. But there was something about the stranger, something warm, something familiar, that made him respond. "I lost my wife," David murmured. "She was my whole world. And now, I don't know how to move forward. I don't even know if I want to." The old man nodded, as if he understood. "Tell me," he said softly, "have you ever seen a river stop flowing?" David frowned, caught off guard by the question. "No," he said. "A river always moves forward." The man smiled. "Exactly," he said. "Life is like that. It moves, whether we want it to or not. The pain you feel now, it is real, and it is deep. But just like a river does not stop at a single rock, you must not let this pain stop you from living." David looked away, his throat tight. How could this man speak so simply about something so unbearable? As if reading his thoughts, the old man continued. "There is an old teaching," he said. "It says, everything happens for a reason. Not as a punishment, not as a curse, but as a lesson. Sometimes, in our greatest sorrow, we find our greatest wisdom. If you open your heart, you may begin to see that even in loss, there is something to be gained." David wanted to argue. He wanted to say that no wisdom could ever replace Mary's presence. But something about the man's words stirred something deep inside him, a small flicker of curiosity in the middle of his grief. "What could I possibly gain from losing the love of my life?" David asked, his voice breaking. The old man met his gaze, his expression full of understanding. "Maybe," he said, "this is your chance to learn how to love in a new way. Not by holding on, but by letting go. Not by seeking what was, but by embracing what is. Maybe your journey isn't over, David. Maybe it's just beginning." For the first time in months, David felt something other than pain. That he wasn't sure if it was hope, but it was something. And sometimes, something is enough to take the first step forward. Yellow Heart, if this story speaks to you, if you've ever felt lost in grief or questioned why life unfolds the way it does, know that you are not alone. Yellow Heart, if you want to continue exploring the wisdom of life, healing, and moving forward, consider subscribing to our channel. Let's take this journey together. Sparkles, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes, we just need to learn how to see it. Impermanence, accepting that everything changes. David sat in silence, letting the old man's words settle in his mind. Maybe your journey isn't over. Maybe it's just beginning. The idea unsettled him. How could life be beginning when everything that made it worth living was gone? He had spent months trying to hold on to the past, to a world where Mary was still by his side. But no matter how tightly he clung to his memories, the reality remained unchanged. She was gone. The old man watched him carefully, as if understanding the storm inside him. "Tell me, David," he said after a long pause. "Have you ever watched the seasons change?" David furrowed his brow. It seemed like an odd question, but he nodded. "In the autumn, the trees shed their leaves," the old man continued. "The branches become bare, and the world looks lifeless. But do the trees grieve? Do they fight to hold on to what is already meant to fall away?" David glanced around the park, where golden leaves covered the ground. The wind carried them away, scattering them like whispers of what once was. "Then winter arrives," the old man said. "Cold and harsh. The world seems silent, empty. But beneath the frost, life is still there, waiting. And when spring comes, the trees blossom again. New leaves, new flowers, new life." David exhaled slowly, watching as a small gust of wind lifted a few leaves into the air. He had never thought about it that way before. "Life is always changing," the old man said gently. "Just like the seasons, nothing stays the same forever. Not joy, not sorrow, not even loss." David swallowed hard. He wanted to argue that some losses were too great, too final. But something about the metaphor stirred something deep inside him. For months, he had resisted this truth. He had fought against it, clung to the past, wished for things to go back to the way they were. But the past was like those autumn leaves. It had already fallen, already been carried away by time. And yet, the tree did not die. "So what do I do?" David asked, his voice quieter than before. The old man looked at him kindly. "You learn to let go. The weight of holding on." That night, David sat in his dimly lit living room, holding a framed picture of Mary. It was taken on their last vacation. Together, standing by the ocean, her laughter frozen in time, that he traced the outline of her face with his fingertips, feeling the familiar ache rise in his chest. "I don't know how to let go." "Mary," he whispered. The thought of moving forward felt like a betrayal, as if accepting her absence meant he was leaving her behind. But then, something the old man said echoed in his mind. "Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means making space for what is still to come." David closed his eyes. Had he been so consumed by grief that he had shut out everything else? He thought about his daughter, Emily, who had tried so many times to get him to join her for dinner, to visit his grandson's baseball game. Each time, he had refused. He had convinced himself that his grief was proof of his love for Mary. But was that really true? Would Mary have wanted him to live like this, trapped in memories, shutting out the world? Letting go does not mean we stop loving. It means we learn to love differently. David took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine something other than his sorrow. Maybe love wasn't just in the past. Maybe it was also in the moments still waiting to be lived. The river keeps flowing. A few days later, David returned to the park. This time, he came not to sit in silence, but to watch. He watched a young couple laughing as they pushed a baby stroller along the path. He watched an elderly woman feeding birds, her eyes soft with contentment. He watched children running, their laughter filling the air. And then, he watched the river. The water moved effortlessly, flowing around rocks and fallen branches, never stopping. Even when it encountered obstacles, it found a way forward. David realized something then. He had been standing still, stuck in a moment that had already passed. But life was still moving. And he had a choice: that he could keep resisting, clinging to what was gone, or he could follow the river's example and learn to move with the current. The thought scared him, but it also felt like hope. That evening, David picked up the phone and called Emily. "Would you still like me to come over for dinner?" he asked. There was a pause, then the sound of her breath catching. "Of course, Dad," she said softly. "I'd love that." And just like that, something shifted. It was small, but it was enough. Embracing impermanence. Change is one of the hardest things for us to accept. We hold on to the past because it is familiar, because it is safe. But in doing so, we often close ourselves off from the beauty of what is still ahead. David's journey is one we all walk at some point, that we lose people we love. We face unexpected challenges. Life moves in ways we never planned, but when we learn to embrace impermanence, we free ourselves from suffering. Pain is inevitable, but suffering? Suffering comes from our resistance to change. When we let go of that resistance, we make room for peace, that we make room for life. A message for you: if you've ever struggled with letting go of a person, a dream, a past version of yourself, you are not alone. David's story is a reminder that change, no matter how painful, is not the end. It is simply the next chapter. And even when we don't understand it, life always knows how to keep flowing. Karma. We shape our future with the choices we make today. David sat at the dinner table, surrounded by the warmth of his daughter's home. The sounds of clinking dishes and soft laughter filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence he had grown used to. His grandson, Jake, sat across from him, talking excitedly about his baseball game. For the first time in months, David felt present. He wasn't trapped in the past, nor was he anxiously thinking about the future. He was simply there, sharing a meal with his family. As he watched Emily refill his cup of tea, he thought about how easy it had been to say no to these moments before. How he had let his grief isolate him. It had been a choice, one he hadn't even realized he was making. The old man's words echoed in his mind. Every action we take, every thought we nurture, sends ripples into the world. Nothing happens by chance. We shape our future with the choices we make today. David had spent months believing that life had taken something from him. But what if, in some way, he had also been shaping his own suffering? The ripple effect of our actions. The next morning, David returned to the park. This time, he wasn't looking for solitude. He sat on the same bench where he had met the old man, watching the world move around him. Nearby, a small boy sat alone, his shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. He looked no older than 10. David wasn't sure why, but he felt drawn to the child. He hesitated for a moment, then stood up and walked over. "Mind if I sit here?" David asked. The boy gave a small shrug. Not looking up, David sat down, letting the silence settle before speaking again. "Tough day." The boy kicked at the gravel with his shoe. "Yeah." David nodded. "I've had a few of those myself." For a moment, the boy didn't respond. Then, in a quiet voice, he muttered, "Some kids at school make fun of me." David felt something stir inside him. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's not fair." The boy sighed. "My dad says I should just ignore them. But it still hurts." David looked out at the river, watching the way the water carried fallen leaves along its surface. He thought about the days after Mary's passing, how people had told him to move on, as if grief could be ignored like background noise. "I know what you mean," David said. "Sometimes, even when we know we should let go, the pain doesn't disappear right away." The boy glanced at him then, his expression softening. David smiled slightly. "But you know what I've learned? Every choice we make, even the small ones, shapes what comes next. When someone hurts us, we can choose to hold on to that pain, or we can decide to use it differently." The boy frowned. "How?" "Well," David said, "what if, instead of letting them make you feel small, you decide to be even kinder than before? What if you make sure no one else feels the way they made you feel?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Slowly. "Maybe." David patted the boy's shoulder. "It's not easy. But every time we choose kindness, we change the world in ways we don't always see right away." As David stood to leave, the boy looked up. "Thanks," he said softly. David nodded, feeling something shift inside him. He had come to the park looking for peace, but he had found something even more valuable, a reminder that his actions, no matter how small, had the power to change not only his own life, but also the lives of those around him. Karma is not punishment. It is a reflection. That evening, David thought about the boy's words. "My dad says I should just ignore them. But it still hurts." For so long, David had believed that karma was something that simply happened to people, that it was some invisible force deciding who deserved what. But the old man had said something different. Karma is not about punishment or reward. It is a reflection of what we put into the world. David thought about his own pain, his own choices. He had isolated himself after losing Mary, and in doing so, he had unknowingly created even more loneliness. He had assumed that time alone would heal him, but healing had only begun when he chose to reconnect with Emily, with Jake, with that young boy in the park. Maybe karma wasn't something mysterious or distant. Maybe it was just the simple truth that what we give is what we receive. He remembered something else the old man had said. If you plant apple seeds, you will grow apples. If you plant thorns, you will grow thorns. David had spent months planting sorrow. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to plant something else. Small choices, big changes. The next morning, David woke up earlier than usual. Instead of pouring a cup of coffee and sitting in silence, he picked up the phone and called an old friend he hadn't spoken to in months. They talked for over an hour. Later that afternoon, he walked to the market and picked up fresh ingredients. That evening, instead of eating alone, he invited his neighbors over for dinner. One small choice at a time. He was rewriting the story he had been telling himself that he could not change the past. He could not bring Mary back. But he could shape what happened next. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. That we are the architects of our lives. That David's journey is one that many of us walk. We go through pain, and sometimes it feels unfair. We wonder why things happen the way they do. But karma is not about deserving or not deserving. It is about cause and effect, the way we treat others, the energy we put into the world, the way we respond to hardship. All of it shapes what comes next. When we choose bitterness, we grow more bitterness. When we choose love, we grow more love. And every small decision, every phone call, every act of kindness, every moment of patience becomes a seed for the future. David's story is a reminder that it is never too late to change the direction we are heading. That we may not control everything that happens to us, but we always control how we respond. A message for you. If you have ever felt lost in grief, anger, or regret, know this: every moment is a chance to begin again. The choices you make today will shape the days that followed. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to continue exploring the wisdom of life, healing, and moving forward, consider subscribing to our channel. The seeds you plant today will grow into the life you live tomorrow. Choose them wisely. Letting go, loving without holding on, living without fear of loss. David sat in his living room, staring at the old wooden bookshelf Mary had once adored. It was filled with novels she had read over and over again, their pages worn with time. She had always believed that books held pieces of a person's soul, that the stories we cherish become part of us. But now, the bookshelf felt more like a shrine than a source of comfort. Every time David walked past it, he felt an ache deep in his chest. It reminded him of everything he had lost. For months, he had left it untouched. He couldn't bring himself to move anything, as if doing so would erase the last traces of her presence. But tonight, something was different. He reached out and ran his fingers along the spines of the books, his hand trembling slightly. As he did, something slipped from between the pages of an old novel, something small and delicate. A letter David's breath caught as he recognized Mary's handwriting on the envelope. His hands shook as he carefully opened it, his heart pounding. My love, if you're reading this, it means life has moved in a direction neither of us could control. It means you are standing in a place I can no longer walk beside you. I know you, David. I know how much you love with all your heart, and I know how much you struggle with letting go. But love was never meant to be held in clenched fists. It was always meant to be open hands, open hearts. Love does not die. It only changes form. David felt tears burn his eyes as he clutched the letter, his vision blurring. Please don't let my absence be what keeps you from living. Don't let grief be the shadow that follows you. Let it be a reminder of how much we lived, how deeply we loved. And when you're ready, love again. Not because you need to replace me, but because love was never meant to stop flowing. I am with you, always. Mary. David pressed the letter to his chest, his shoulders shaking. He had spent so long trying to hold on to Mary, trying to keep her alive, in the stillness of his grief. But he had misunderstood something essential. Letting go did not mean forgetting. It did not mean loving any less. It simply meant making space for life to continue, holding on too tightly. The next morning, David went for a walk. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet. He found himself back at the park, sitting on the same bench where he had spoken with the old man weeks before. As he sat there, he noticed a father and daughter by the river. The little girl clutched a paper boat in her hands, her brow furrowed in concentration. Let it go, her father urged gently. But what if it sinks? she asked. The father smiled. Then it will become part of the river, just as it was meant to. Hesitantly, the girl released the boat. It wobbled for a moment, then caught the current, drifting gracefully down the stream. David watched as the girl's face lit up, her fear replaced by wonder. He thought about Mary's letter, about how love was never meant to be clenched in fists. He thought about the way he had held on to his grief, convinced that if he let it go, he would lose her all over again. But love, real love, was not something that could be lost. It was in the way he still spoke to her at night, in the laughter he shared with Emily and Jake, in the kindness he had shown to the boy in the park. Mary had never left. She was in the river, in the autumn breeze, in the space between every breath. And in that moment, David knew what he had to do. Releasing the past, embracing the present. That evening, David stood before Mary's bookshelf once more. But this time, he did not feel trapped by it. He carefully ran his hands over the books, selecting a few that he knew she had loved the most. Then, he placed them in a box and carried them to the car. The next morning, he drove to the local library and donated them. As he handed the books over to the librarian, he felt something shift inside him. Something lighter, something freer. Mary's books would not sit in silence any longer. They would be held by hands that turned their pages, read by eyes that discovered new worlds within them. Love was meant to keep moving, and so was he, living without fear of loss. Weeks passed, and little by little, David continued to let go, not of Mary, but of the fear that had held him prisoner. He started saying yes to things he had once avoided. He joined his daughter for coffee, laughing as they reminisced about old memories. He went to Jake's baseball game, cheering from the stands. As his grandson beamed with pride. One afternoon, while walking in the park, he met a woman named Margaret. She was reading on a bench, lost in thought, and something about her reminded him of Mary, the quiet way she observed the world, the gentle kindness in her eyes. They spoke about books, about their favorite authors, about life's unexpected turns. David felt something he hadn't in a long time. That it wasn't a replacement for what he had lost. That it was something new. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Love never leaves. It only changes form. David's story is a reminder that letting go is not about losing what we love. It is about trusting that love does not disappear. It only transforms. That we fear change because we believe it will take something away from us. But often, it is in change that we find our deepest growth. Grief is the weight of love that has nowhere to go. But when we begin to let go, we allow love to take new shapes, to become kindness, to become connection, to become life itself. Holding on too tightly to the past does not honor what we lost. Living fully is what honors them the most today. Message for you. If you have ever struggled with letting go, know this: love is never lost. It stays with us in the way we remember, in the way we cherish, in the way we continue to give it to others. It is okay to move forward. It is okay to open your heart again, because love was never meant to be kept in one place. It was meant to flow, just like the river. If this story speaks to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue exploring wisdom, healing, and the journey of life, consider subscribing to our channel. Letting go is not the end. It is just the beginning of something new. Acceptance. When we stop resisting life, we find peace. David had always believed that life was something to be controlled. He had built his world with careful precision, his career, his marriage, his home. He had spent decades making sure everything was in its right place, protecting the people he loved, believing that if he just held on tightly enough, life would unfold according to plan. But then Mary was gone. And no amount of effort, no amount of planning, could change that. For months, he had resisted reality, wishing it were different. He had replayed the past in his mind, thinking of all the ways things could have gone another way. Maybe if they had caught her illness sooner. Maybe if he had done something differently. Maybe if he had prayed harder, hoped stronger, loved more. But no matter how many times he turned the thoughts over in his mind, nothing changed. The past remained the past. One afternoon, as he sat in the park, he saw the old man again, the same one who had spoken to him about impermanence weeks before. This time, David didn't wait for the man to speak. "I've tried to move forward," David admitted. "I've let go of some things. I've tried to be present. But there's still a part of me that can't accept what happened. A part of me that keeps Asking what? The old man nodded, as if he understood this struggle well. "Let me tell you a story," he said. "The farmer and his horse." There was once a farmer who lived in a small village. One day, his only horse ran away. His neighbors came to console him, saying, "What terrible luck!" But the farmer simply shrugged. "Who knows if it's good or bad?" He said that a few days later, the horse returned, bringing with it several wild horses. His neighbors rejoiced. "What wonderful luck!" they said. Again, the farmer only replied, "Who knows if it's good or bad?" Soon after, the farmer's son tried to ride one of the wild horses, but fell and broke his leg. The neighbors shook their heads. What a terrible misfortune! But the farmer, as always, said, "Who knows if it's good or bad?" Weeks later, war broke out in the land. Every young man in the village was taken to fight, but because of his injury, the farmer's son was spared. David listened carefully, letting the meaning of the story sink in. "The truth," the old man said, "is that we never see the full picture. We label things as good or bad, lucky or unlucky, fair or unfair. But life is not so simple. Sometimes, what feels like a curse today turns out to be a blessing tomorrow." David let out a slow breath. "So you're saying I should just accept things without question?" "Not without question," the old man replied, "but without resistance. When we fight reality, we only create suffering. But when we accept life as it is, we find peace." Surrendering to the present, that night, David sat in his quiet home, thinking about the story. He had spent so much time believing that Mary's passing was something unfair, something that shouldn't have happened. But what if he didn't need to assign it meaning? What if, instead of seeing it as a cruel twist of fate, he simply saw it as life? No more, no less? Maybe the point was not to understand why things happened, but to trust that, even in loss, life continued. And maybe, just maybe, there was something waiting for him on the other side of acceptance. He thought of his grandson's laughter, the warm meals shared with his daughter, the quiet conversations with strangers in the park. Had he been so focused on resisting what he lost that he had failed to see what he still had? For the first time, he did not fight the thought. He did not push it away. Instead, he allowed himself to sit with it, to let it be, finding peace in what is. Acceptance does not mean we approve of everything that happens. It does not mean we stop feeling sadness or longing. It does not mean we give up. It simply means we stop fighting with life. David began to notice the small ways in which acceptance brought peace. He stopped dwelling on what he could not change. Instead, he focused on where he was now, on what was still in front of him, that he no longer saw each moment of joy as something tainted by loss, but as something whole in itself. That he still missed Mary. He always would. But missing her did not have to mean staying trapped in the past. He could love her and still move forward. He could hold on to memories without letting them hold him back. And in doing so, he felt lighter. Life is not meant to be controlled. That we spend much of our lives trying to control the uncontrollable. We plan, we prepare, we hold on tightly, believing that if we do everything right, things will unfold the way we want. But life has its own rhythm, its own course. Some things will happen, no matter how much we resist them. Some chapters will close, whether we are ready or not. And the more we fight against reality, the more we suffer. But when we surrender, not in defeat, but in trust, something shifts. That we begin to see that life is not against us. That it is simply moving, changing, evolving. And when we stop resisting, we find that peace was there all along, waiting for us to stop struggling long enough to notice it. A message for you. If you are carrying pain, if you are holding on to something that is keeping you stuck, know this: you do not have to fight life to find happiness. Peace is not found in controlling everything. It is found in letting go of the need to. Whatever has happened, whatever has changed, you are still here. And life is still offering you new moments, new possibilities. Accept what is, trust what will be. And in that space, you will find the peace you have been searching for all along. If this message resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to continue exploring wisdom, healing, and the journey of life, consider subscribing to our channel. Sometimes, the greatest freedom comes when we finally stop fighting. Mindfulness. Happiness exists in this very moment. David sat on his porch, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The morning air was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and gold. He could hear the distant laughter of children on their way to school, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the rhythmic chirping of birds greeting the day. For months, he had woken up each morning trapped in thoughts of the past, haunted by memories of what once was. But today, for the first time in a long time, he simply sat and noticed the warmth of the mug in his hands, the way the steam curled into the air, the quiet rise and fall of his own breath. For the first time, he was not lost in thoughts of yesterday or worries about tomorrow. He was here. And for the first time, here felt like enough, lost in thought, missing life. Before Mary passed, David had never thought much about mindfulness. He had spent his life in motion, planning, working, building a future. There was always something to do, somewhere to be, something to chase. Even in moments of rest, his mind was always elsewhere. He would sip his morning coffee while thinking about his to-do list. He would eat dinner while distracted by the evening news. He would take walks but hardly notice the world around him. He had lived for years that way, always caught between the past and the future, rarely present in the moment unfolding before him. But now, without Mary, without the future he had imagined, he realized how much of life he had let slip by unnoticed. And he didn't want to live that way anymore. The practice of presence. The old man in the park had spoken of mindfulness before, but it wasn't until now that David truly understood. Most people, the old man had said, spend their lives either looking backward with regret or looking forward with anxiety. But peace is never found in either place. Peace is always here, in this moment. David had nodded, though at the time, the words had felt distant, like a concept meant for monks meditating on mountaintops rather than for an old man grieving in the middle of a city park. But something about them stayed with him. So he began to practice it first. It was small. He started by noticing his breath, the way it moved in and out, steady and constant, like the waves of the ocean. He practiced when he ate, savoring each bite rather than rushing through meals without tasting them. He practiced when he walked, feeling the ground beneath his feet, listening to the rhythm of his steps, noticing the way sunlight filtered through the trees. It wasn't always easy. His mind still wandered, still pulled him toward memories and worries. But every time it did, he gently brought it back to his breath, back to the sensations around him, back to the now. And little by little, something shifted. The gift of the present moment. One afternoon, David sat by the river, watching the water flow. He thought about how much time he had spent waiting for the pain to go away, waiting for things to make sense, waiting for happiness to return. But happiness, he realized, was never something to be found in the future. It was here, in the quiet joy of sipping warm coffee, in the embrace of his daughter, in the sound of Jake's laughter, in the simple act of being alive. All those years he had spent rushing through life, believing happiness was just around the corner, just one more accomplishment away. He had never realized that happiness had always been waiting for him, right here, in the moments he had overlooked. He had spent so much time searching for something he already had, living fully, right now. David still missed Mary. He always would. But now, instead of letting his grief pull him away from life, he used it as a reminder to be present, a reminder to cherish the moments he still had, a reminder that life was not meant to be lived in the past or the future, but in the here and now. He no longer rushed through his mornings. Instead, he listened to the birds, felt the warmth of the sun on his skin, took the time to truly enjoy his first sip of coffee. He no longer let worry consume him. Instead, he focused on what he could do today, how he could show love, how he could be kind, how he could fully experience the life still unfolding before him. And for the first time, he felt truly alive. A message for you. How often do we let life pass us by, caught in thoughts of the past or worries about the future? How many moments have we missed simply because we weren't paying attention? Happiness is not something we need to chase. It is something we need to notice right now. In this very moment, there is peace to be found. In the breath you are taking, in the sounds around you, in the simple act of being present. If this message speaks to you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you want to continue exploring wisdom, healing, and the beauty of being present, consider subscribing to our channel. Happiness is here, right now. All we have to do is notice. The lesson and final message. David sat on the park bench, watching the river flow. The water moved effortlessly, never stopping, never resisting. It simply followed its course, embracing each twist and turn without hesitation that he had spent so much of his life trying to control the uncontrollable, trying to hold on to things that were never meant to stay the same. But life, he had come to realize, was not something to be grasped. It was something to be experienced. That Mary's passing had left a hole in his heart, but it had also given him a deeper understanding of love. Love was not about possession. It was not about keeping things unchanged. It was about cherishing each moment while it lasted, then letting go when it was time, trusting that love itself never truly disappears. He had learned that everything in life is temporary. Joy, sorrow, success, loss. Fighting against change only brought suffering, but embracing it brought peace. Karma had taught him that every action, every thought, every choice creates ripples that shape his future. He was no longer a passive observer of his own life. He was an active participant, planting seeds of kindness, connection, and presence. And mindfulness had shown him that happiness was never in the past he longed for, nor in the future he worried about. It was here, in the simple moments. The warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of his grandson's laughter, the quiet stillness of the morning. David took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace he had not known in a long time. For the first time since Mary's passing, he wasn't just surviving, that he was living. A lesson for all of us that David's journey is not unique. We all experience loss, change, and moments of uncertainty. We all struggle with letting go, with finding meaning in hardship, with learning how to live fully. But if there is one truth that life teaches us, it is this: everything happens for a reason, not as a punishment, not as a cruel twist of fate, but as an opportunity to grow, to love, to understand life in a deeper way. Pain is a part of the journey, but so is healing. Loss is inevitable, but so is renewal. The past cannot be changed, and the future is uncertain. But this moment, this breath, this experience, this life, is yours to embrace. Let go of what weighs you down. Trust that life is unfolding exactly as it is meant to. And above all, be present, because happiness is not something to chase. It is something to be found in the life you are already living. A message for you. If David's story speaks to you, if you have ever struggled with loss, resistance, or finding peace, know that you are not alone. Take a deep breath. Be here now, and if this message resonates, share it with someone who may need it. If you would like to continue exploring wisdom, healing, and personal growth, consider subscribing to our channel. Life is happening in this moment. Embrace it,